Good morning and welcome to the Respiratory System 1. This is the conducting zone, and we have two parts to the conducting zone, so this is part 1 of the conducting zone. So to be in the conducting zone of the respiratory tree just means that you are merely conducting air to the periphery of the lung, where the air can then do gas exchange between the capillaries that live in the lung, or also called the alveolar capillaries. So, the nasal, when you breathe air in, air first enters the external nares, or also called the nostrils. And within the nostrils, there are guard hairs in the vestibule. So, once you move past the opening, the nostrils, you are in the vestibule of the nasal cavity. And in there you find guard hairs that can trap particles greater than about 10 micrometers. There's also some mucus in there. As you pass from the nasal cavity deeper into the conducting zone, you go through a passageway called the choani, or a choana. And that isn't an actual structure, it's just a passageway from the nasal cavity into the first part of the pharynx. The roof of the nasal cavity is comprised of the ethmoid and sphenoid bones. So in the bottom right cartoon, you can see the skull. So on the bottom right cartoon, in the upper left of that cartoon, you see the front part of a skull. So you see two eyes, and then you see the ethmoid bone, and then the ethmoid bone is enlarged, the bottom right of that cartoon, and you can see the perpendicular plate and the middle concha or concha and the cribriform plate. So that's all 201 stuff. You don't have to know that for 202 for this class. But this is just a cartoon to remind you the roof of your nasal cavity is comprised of these bones. The floor of the nasal cavity has the hard and soft palates. So if you look on the cartoon, you can see the hard palate is bone, and then the soft palate is just tissue. If you feel your nose, you can feel the bones in there, but then sort of the bones end, and then you get this kind of floppy cartilage at the tip of your nose. But the bone part has a septum, the perpendicular plate, that's going to divide your nasal cavity into a right and left side. So now if we look at this cartoon, we've got a mid-sagittal section of the skull and the part of the throat. And now let's talk about the histology of the upper portion of the conducting zone. It's lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium with goblet cells. So if you remember, pseudostratified just means the cell type looks like it's more than one layer, but it's not. Ciliated just means it has little cilia on the cells. The cilia can move, and they will participate in moving particles that get into your nasal cavity and your throat. Will move those particles towards your mouth so that you can spit the particles out or swallow them and take the particles down into an acidic stomach to hopefully kill any bacteria on the particles. The goblet cells, of course, secrete mucus. So the upper part of the conducting zone will begin with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium with goblet cells, but then the histology of the respiratory tree will change as you go deeper towards the lungs. So for instance, as you get out into the periphery of the lungs, we're going to see that there's a lot less mucus cells, because you don't want to interfere with gas exchange as you get into the periphery of the respiratory tree, so you don't want mucus there. So you wouldn't have goblet cells in the outer branches of the respiratory tree. But you would want mucus in the upper portion so that you can trap particles and, like I said, expectorate them. In other words, to spit them out or to swallow them. So you have both mucus and serous secretions with this pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. So remember, mucus secretion is just a thick secretion, and a serous secretion is more of a watery secretion with serous fluid. So also within the nasal cavity are these conchae and meatus folds. So the conchae are the raised portions of the respiratory epithelium, and the meatus or meati, those are the sort of the valleys of this system. And this system is in place so that when you breathe air in, the air becomes turbulent with the conchae and meatus system, and that gives the air more time to sort of hang out in the nasal cavity so that that air can be warmed and humidified so that when the air gets out into the periphery of the respiratory tree, it will be primed for optimal gas exchange. So underlying the connective tissue of the cavity in this conchae meatus system is rich with blood vessels, of course including capillaries, so that you can have this humidification and warming of the air in the nasal cavity. There's also olfactory receptors, and remember that from those receptors from 201, they allow you to detect odorant molecules. In other words, they allow you to detect smell. Also, just outside the nasal cavity are sinuses in the bone, so spaces in the bone, so that these participate in sound production and also keeping your skull lighter. And then there's this picture of the lacrimal canals. So if you remember from 201, you see in this middle picture with the eyeball, the upper part of on the upper part of the eyelid, just below the eyebrow, is the lacrimal gland that secretes lacrimal fluid across the eye. And then that fluid goes into the lacrimal canals that eventually dump into the nasal cavity. So this is, again, a mid-sagittal section, and this time we're going to look at the nasopharynx. So it's the upper part of the pharynx in yellow in the cartoon. So the narrow nasopharynx is just behind the choanine, which is that passageway from the nasal cavity into the pharynx. Again, the nasopharynx has a continuation of lining with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial cells with goblet cells. That's the goblet cells secrete mucus. It also contains the pharyngeal tonsil and the adenoids and the lymph nodes. So remember, from the immune system, the tonsils are part of the immune system, and they have immune system cells that can fight off foreign invaders that might enter through the respiratory tract. There's also the auditory or eustachian tube, again from 201. The auditory tubes equalize excuse me. The auditory tubes equalize pressure within the middle ear, so the tubes lead from the throat to the middle ear, and that's why if you get an infection in your throat, it can often lead to the middle ear and vice versa. So finally, the part of the nasopharynx, you find the uvula, and then in this cartoon on the left, it also shows a palatine tonsil, which is a lymph organ. So the nasopharynx itself is blocked by the uvula when you swallow, so that when you swallow, the thing that you're swallowing goes to the pharynx or the throat and not up into the nasal cavity. So probably everyone's seen someone do this in grade school. If they're eating Jello or drinking milk and they start to laugh and it comes up through their nose, that's because the uvula, they were laughing in the and the uvula wasn't able to protect entrance of that food into the nasal cavity, and so it came out the nose. So I think that's the last slide.